Chapter 2. Luke. Just a few minutes later, James Taylor received another blow. Leslie fell in love with a little boy in a red and white baseball cap. The boy's head practically disappeared under the cap as he stood on the wet sand at the water's edge, whimpering, while his father splashed about in the shallow water, coaxing him to come in. The boy didn't move, continuing his weak, plaintive cry. The Taylors walked past him, but after a few steps, Leslie turned around, hurried back, and crouched down beside the child to say hello. Surprised, the boy fell silent. He was a strikingly fragile, subdued little fellow. His ribs showed, and his shrunken face made his big, dark, watchful eyes seem even bigger. When Leslie managed to make him smile, she fell in love with him. Jim saw the change on her face and was jealous. He felt rejected, discarded, thrown over. "His name is Luke," said the father, stepping ashore. "We brought him here for his 5th birthday." A fleshy man with a wide, ruddy face, straw-colored hair, and pain in his pale blue eyes, he didn't wish to disturb Luke's encounter with a sympathetic woman, and stayed in the background, striking up a conversation with Jim instead. "By the way, I'm Louis Mayberry." He reached out to shake hands. Desperate to talk to somebody, he forced Jim into a conversation. Jim told him that the redhead was his wife, and he worked with computers. "It's good of your wife to make friends with Luke," the man said in a low voice. "Most people give him a wide berth." A landowner with an estate in Kent, much of it apple orchards, he envied Jim's simpler life with computers. "You're lucky. You don't have to worry about worms eating your programs." "And we do. We have computer bugs." "We didn't spray this year, and we lost half our apple crop." "Not even a third," interjected Anita Mayberry, a slender, tawny-skinned woman in a purple swimsuit, jumping up from a nearby sun-lounger. She had a beautiful but disturbing face. She didn't look at Luke's father. Mayberry's face tensed when he heard her voice. He didn't look at her either. "May I introduce my wife, Anita?" he said grimly. "She knows everything better than I do." She had her back to her husband, addressing him through their new acquaintance. "I do know many things better than you do, but you never listen to me," she snapped, smiling at Jim to show that the hostility in her voice wasn't meant for him. Mayberry moved his eyebrows up and down in mock horror, commenting in a sarcastic whisper, "She thinks I'm a murderer." "And you are a murderer," she said in an equally low voice, flashing another smile at Jim. He thought I'd spare him in front of strangers. "I don't see how I could possibly think that, considering the way she goes on about me to everybody." A yellow beach ball fell at their feet, and they had to move to give way to the girl who was running after it. But the Mayberrys still managed to look in different directions. Though they spoke in low voices to spare their son, they had the compulsive, unrestrained volubility of people under great strain, unburdening themselves to anyone who would listen. The mother blamed the father for the boy's leukemia, believing that it was caused by Mayberry's pesticides and herbicides. "I'm a murderer because I try to protect my crop like any other farmer." Mayberry's voice and expression conveyed all the comment he felt was necessary. "Needless to say, she knows nothing about chemicals. I read the newspapers." "Exactly," Mayberry said, sounding drained. "I have a wife who reads the newspapers to find something she can torment me with." She moved her head and hands rhythmically from side to side to suggest what nonsense he was talking. "Of course," Mayberry went on, "Luke has never been near any spraying. He has never had any contact with anything even remotely toxic. He's a farmer, and he doesn't know anything about winds," she interrupted, still only talking to Jim. Mayberry made a face. "There you are. There you have it. The winds. We stopped spraying to humor her, but it's no use. She has to blame somebody nearer than God." Just then an extraordinary thing happened. As Leslie said something to Luke and pointed to a heron flying by, the boy started laughing. His thin, weary laugh, so different from the confident shrieks of other children on the beach, had something eerie about it. It was an old man's laugh in a child's voice. It made Jim shiver, but it produced a miraculous change in the parents. Their tense faces smoothed out, their eyes flashed with joy, and they exchanged glances. As they joined Luke and Leslie, Jim finally took a good look at the boy. Noticing how shocked he was, Anita Mayberry began to talk animatedly about her son's illness and treatment. She spoke in a determinedly upbeat manner, as if she were describing an exciting adventure. "Luke's already had his second bone marrow transplant," she announced triumphantly. "I used to be a lot sicker," Luke himself commented, listening to his mother's explanation with interest, even with some pride. "I have to go to the hospital a lot, but I'm not afraid. The doctors and nurses are all my friends." When he looked up, his baseball cap slipped, exposing his bald head. Leslie shot an anguished glance at Jim as she replaced the cap. But Luke wanted them to see his head, and he lifted his cap to show that chemotherapy takes your hair away temporarily. He used the word temporarily frequently. He understood almost everything about his illness except that it was terminal. "Jim, look what gleaming eyes Luke has!" Leslie exclaimed. But Jim was watching Leslie's eyes. They were gleaming with joyful love, as Luke's smile grew wide enough to reveal his small, white, even teeth. Jim tried to remember the last time that Leslie had looked at him with that kind of fervour. "You're absolutely besotted with that kid," he said accusingly when they got back to their apartment. Without responding, Leslie went to the bathroom to have a shower. "I'm jealous of a dying boy," Jim reflected, sitting down on a chair and pulling his fingers mechanically one after the other, stopping abruptly when he realized what he was doing. Leslie reappeared, wrapped in a white bathrobe with Gulf views embroidered on it in blue, and stepped to the balcony with her back to her husband. "I hope I wouldn't have got so upset if the boy had another name," Jim said by way of apology. "I was worried that he's reminding you of our Luke." Leslie wished she could tell him that every toddler reminded her of their Luke. "Would you feel less sorry for the boy if he was called Jeremy?" she asked. Jeremy Norton was the executive chairman who had sacked Jim the previous evening. "Of course not. Poor kid. I'm glad you could make him laugh. It's amazing, isn't it? No matter how sick a child is, you can still make him laugh." "He likes you. He senses that you love him," he sighed. "Did you notice how Luke's parents hate each other?" she asked. "Not having a child isn't the worst thing that can happen to you." He hoped she meant it. During the night he clung to her as if afraid she would leave him. They ended up at the opposite edges of the king-size bed. He was the first to wake, feeling the chill of the morning air. Jim drew her towards the middle. He hugged her, and she smiled, but then pushed him away. "Oh, dear, we can't," she exclaimed. "I promised to have breakfast with Luke. I can't disappoint him." She gave him a strong kiss and leapt out of bed. "What about disappointing me?" asked Jim, but by then she was gone. Later, as he sat by the pool, pulling his fingers, his body hidden in a bathrobe, watching Leslie helping Luke to draw a heron on the back of a menu from the beach bar, he convinced himself that the most important person in her life had always been the child. Every time he heard Leslie laughing, his mind went into a spin, collecting all the evidence of his guilt. No doubt Leslie would have spent more time with him if she had realized how despondent he was. But whenever she said, "I promised Luke," or "I can't disappoint Luke," and left, Jim remained silent, not wishing to appear jealous of a dying child. Leslie hoped that the sea air, the balmy weather, and the peace would help her husband get over the shock of his dismissal. But after more than 2 weeks' rest, he had such a sense of ill-being that he longed for death.